Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Let's take you across to America. Rex Tillerson is making a statement. Let's listen in.
Secretary of State will terminate at midnight, March the 31st. Between now and then, I will address a few administrative matters related to my departure and work towards a smooth and orderly transition for Secretary of State designate Mike Pompeo. I'm encouraging my policy planning team and undersecretaries and assistant secretaries, those confirmed, as well as those in acting positions, to remain at their post and continue our mission at the State Department and working with the interagency process. I will be meeting members of my front office team and policy planning later today to thank them for their service. They have been extraordinarily dedicated to our mission, which includes promoting values that I view as being very important. The safety and security of our State Department personnel, accountability, which means treating each other with honesty and integrity, and respect for one another. Most recently, in particular, to address challenges of sexual harassment within the department. I want to speak now to my State Department colleagues and to our interagency colleagues and partners at DOD and the Joint Chiefs of Staff, most particularly. To my Foreign Service officers and civil service colleagues, we all took the same oath of office. Whether you're a career, employee, or political appointee, we are all bound by that common commitment to support and defend the Constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, and to faithfully discharge the duties of our office. As a State Department, we are bound together by that oath. We remain steadfast here in Washington and at posts across the world, many of whom are in danger-pay situations without their families. The world needs selfless leaders like these, ready to work with long-standing allies, new emerging partners and allies, who now, many are struggling as democracies, and in some cases are dealing with human tragedy, crisis of natural disasters, literally crawling themselves out of those circumstances. These are experiences that no lecture hall in an academic environment or at a think tank can teach you. Only by people going to the front lines to serve can they develop this kind of talent. To the men and women in uniform, I'm told for the first time in most people's memory, the Department of State and Department of Defense have a close working relationship where we all agree the U.S. leadership starts with diplomacy. The men and women in uniform at the Department of Defense, under the leadership of Secretary Mattis and General Dunford, protect us as Americans and our way of life daily, at home and abroad. As an all-volunteer military, they do it for love of country, they do it for you, and they do it for me, and for no other reason. As Americans, we are all eternally grateful to each of them, and we honor their sacrifices. The rewarding part of having leadership and partnerships in place is that you can actually get some things done. And I want to give recognition to the State Department and our partners for a few of their accomplishments under this administration. First, working with allies, we exceeded the expectations of almost everyone with the DPRK maximum pressure campaign. With the announcement on my very first trip as Secretary of State to the region that the era of strategic patience was over, and we commenced the steps to dramatically increase not just the scope, but the effectiveness of the sanctions. The department undertook a global campaign to bring partners and allies on board in every country around the world, with every embassy and mission raising this to the highest levels. And at every meeting I've had throughout the year, this has been on the agenda to discuss. The adoption of the South Asia strategy with a conditions-based military plan as the tool to compel the Taliban to reconciliation and peace talks with the Afghan government. Finally, equipped our military planners with a strategy which they can execute as opposed to a succession of 16 one-year strategies. This clear military commitment attracted the support of allies broadly and equipped our diplomats with a whole new level of certainty around how to prepare for the peace talks and achieve the final objectives. In other areas, while progress has been made, much work remains. In Syria, we did achieve important ceasefires and stabilizations, which we know has saved thousands of lives. There's more to be done in Syria, particularly with respect to achieving the peace, as well as stabilizing Iraq and seeing a healthy government installed, and more broadly in the entire global campaign to defeat ISIS. Nothing is possible without allies and partners, though. Much work remains to establish a clear view of the nature of our future relationship with China. How shall we deal with one another over the next 50 years and ensure a period of prosperity for all of our peoples, free of conflict between two very powerful nations? And much work remains to respond to the troubling behavior and actions on the part of the Russian government. Russia must assess carefully as to how its actions are in the best interest of the Russian people and of the world more broadly. Continuing on their current trajectory is likely to lead to greater isolation on their part, a situation which is not in anyone's interest. So to my colleagues in the State Department and the interagency, much remains to be done to achieve our mission on behalf of the American people, with allies and with partners. I close by thanking all for the privilege of serving beside you for the last 14 months. Importantly, to the 300+ million Americans, thank you for your devotion to a free and open society, to acts of kindness towards one another, to honesty and the quiet, hard work that you do every day to support this government with your tax dollars. All of us, we know, want to leave this place as a better place for the next generation. I'll now return to private life as a private citizen, as a proud American, proud of the opportunity I've had to serve my country. God bless all of you. God bless the American people. God bless America.
Well, that was the former Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, confirming that his tenure in the office will terminate. He said that it was important to ensure a smooth transition after he was sacked by President Trump. He also said that the maximum pressure campaign against North Korea has succeeded beyond expectations, and says the achieved ceasefire in Syria saved lives, but much more work needs to be done. Let's talk to Adele Robinson, who was following that, who's in Washington for us. Adele, you do get the sense that Mr. Tillerson was surprised by this departure.
Yeah, well, there was still, I would say, a lack of clarity about, crucially, how he was told and when he was actually told that he was being sacked. Up till now, we hadn't heard from Rex Tillerson. We'd only heard from one of his top aides, who'd released a statement earlier on today saying that he had every intention of carrying on because of the critical progress that was being made on national security, and also that he hadn't spoken to the president and that he was unaware of the reasons why he was being fired. Now, interestingly, that top aide has now been sacked himself, and there was some suggestion that President Trump's tweet was the first time that Tillerson found out that he was being asked to step down. So no clarity from his speech there, although he did say that he received a call from Donald Trump from Air Force One on his way to California around 3 hours after the announcement was made on Twitter by the president. He effectively, that speech was him graciously accepting that he was being sacked, whilst making a few comments on some outstanding international issues. Notably, he mentioned Russia and said that the current trajectory that they are on would mean that they would continue to isolate themselves on a global scale. With regards to Tillerson's sacking, though, overall it's been unsurprising, basically because of his relationship with Donald Trump being at odds for some time now. It was in October last year that he reportedly described Trump as a moron in a meeting with national security advisors behind closed doors. And also, quite publicly, they've differed on some major international policies, most notably the nuclear Iran deal, also the approach to North Korea, and also, even yesterday, there were signs of division between the State Department and the White House on the Russian ex-spy poisoning in the UK, when we had Sarah Sanders basically refusing to be drawn specifically on the Russian connection, and then Tillerson a few hours later actually making that connection, saying it was clear, or it appeared to be clear, that they potentially were responsible, and saying that this could almost certainly trigger a reaction. It's bad timing, though, perhaps for the president in a way, because he still doesn't have a team of high expertise around him ahead of that crucial summit in North Korea. He doesn't have an ambassador to South Korea. He doesn't have a new secretary. Well, he has a new Secretary of State. He doesn't have any assistant secretary to East Asia either. So interesting timing, especially with Mike Pompeo coming on board, who is someone who's a Trump loyalist. It would appear that Trump doesn't like people who disagree with him.
Adele, thank you.
Well, Britain will respond to Russia alongside a new US Secretary of State after President Trump suddenly sacked Rex Tillerson. Now, he'd been at odds with the president on several key foreign policy issues. It comes ahead of landmark talks with North Korea, as our Washington correspondent Robert Moore reports.
He was Secretary of State for just over a year. And immediately after returning from this trip to Africa, Rex Tillerson suffered the ultimate humiliation, being fired out of the blue and reportedly finding out about it on Twitter. For the president, the reshuffle only adds to a sense of an administration in chaos. Though as he left the White House today, Trump tried to suggest it was almost amicable and driven by a policy difference.
Rex and I have been talking about this for a long time. We got along actually quite well, but we disagreed on things. When you look at the Iran deal, I think it's terrible. I guess he thought it was okay. I wanted to either break it or do something, and he felt a little bit differently.
And ominously for others in the cabinet, the firings may not be over.
I'm really at a point where we're getting very close to having the cabinet and other things that I want.
In the last few minutes, Tillerson has implored officials to follow the Constitution, and he thanked the American people, but notably not his president.
Importantly, to the 300+ million Americans, thank you for your devotion to a free and open society, to acts of kindness towards one another, to honesty and the quiet hard work that you do every day.
Replacing Tillerson as America's top diplomat, assuming he gets confirmed by the Senate, is Mike Pompeo, the current CIA chief. The president is now heading to the border with Mexico to advocate for building the wall, after a day that has left Washington stunned. Amid all of this turmoil, the president must make critical foreign policy judgments. Firstly, he must decide to what extent he acts alongside number 10 in punishing Russia for the Salisbury attack. And secondly, he is potentially just weeks away from that momentous summit with North Korea's Kim Jong-un. Robert Moore, ITV News, Washington.
Well, it's no secret President Trump and Rex Tillerson's relationship was on the rocks, but why the messy breakup now? Could it be over the sudden announcement that the president would meet Kim Jong-un? Or is Mr. Trump annoyed his Secretary of State condemned Russia after the Salisbury nerve agent attack? Whatever the cause, whatever the split, President Trump has already moved on, appointing CIA Director Mike Pompeo to run the State Department. We're joined now from Washington by Kylie Morris. Kylie.
John, you're right. In some ways, this was long expected, but at the same time, it was shockingly abrupt today. I mean, the president is insisting that this is not chaos, only great energy. It adds to the sense of a revolving door, though, at the White House, where senior advisors and key aides are leaving every day, every week, every month, it seems. Remember, Gary Cohn, the economic advisor, left only last week. Rex Tillerson today. That means 2 senior advisors with global outlooks are out, and they'll be replaced with those who fit Trump's nationalist mold much more easily. I think for the UK, it's not great news in my analysis. The new Secretary of State, CIA boss Mike Pompeo, is more of a hardliner on Iran, who wants the Iran deal gone. And then there's the idea that Rex Tillerson's condemnation of Russia after the Salisbury attack might have won the disapproval of President Trump. We'll get to the how it happened in a moment. But here's the president explaining why it did. The chemistry, he says, just wasn't there, and he'd met someone else.
Rex and I have been talking about this for a long time. We got along actually quite well, but we disagreed on things. When you look at the Iran deal, I think it's terrible. I guess it was okay. With Mike Pompeo, we have a very similar thought process. I think it's going to go very well.
The president and his Secretary of State were in different worlds. While the president was thinking of the perfect tweet to sack him, Rex Tillerson was wrapping up a tour to Africa. Before flying home, he issued a strongly worded statement in support of the Prime Minister, Theresa May, facing down Russia. While he described the US as outraged by the Salisbury nerve agent attack and labelled Russia an irresponsible force of instability in the world, well, the president isn't there yet.
I don't know if they've come to a conclusion, but she's calling me today.
The president sounds as if he's still to be convinced.
As soon as we get the facts straight, if we agree with them, we will condemn Russia or whoever it may be. But I have not spoken to her. I'll speak to her sometime today.
I serve at the appointment of the president, and I'm here for as long as the president feels I can be useful to achieving his objectives.
6 months ago, Rex Tillerson felt compelled to proclaim his loyalty to Trump. Although the president had clearly been excited by hiring the former Exxon boss for his cabinet, they proved at odds over Iran and North Korea, as well as the president's authoritarian tendencies.
Could you address the main headline of this story that you called the president a moron? And if not, where do you think these reports or
I'm not going to deal with petty stuff like that. I mean, this is what I don't understand about Washington.
He was happiest, it seemed, on a plane to a far-flung destination out of the Washington news cycle. But that meant he was easily blindsided. Just hours before, a South Korean delegation last Thursday declared that President Trump would meet North Korea's leader Kim Jong-un.
By May.
The Secretary of State was in Africa still, explaining why that was a long way off.
I think the first step, and I've said this before, is to have talks, have some kind of talks about talks.
The president says one reason for Rex Tillerson's removal is so Mike Pompeo can lead his diplomatic dream team into negotiations with North Korea. But the reserves of the department meant to prepare for those talks are drained. Secretary Tillerson's drive for efficiency, cheered on by the president, gutted its ranks and left dozens of senior positions unfilled.
Change for the sake of change can be counterproductive, and that will never be my approach. But we cannot sustain ineffective traditions over optimal outcomes.
In the end, it was the secretary himself who suffered the most non-optimal of outcomes. According to the State Department, he was given no reason for his sacking and had not spoken to the president, elevating rumours that Rex Tillerson first learned of his sacking from a presidential tweet. So the Secretary of State has now confirmed that he was only phoned by President Trump, who's en route to California, hours after the president had tweeted the fact that he was sacked. Now, he's just spoken at the State Department, pointedly, I think, not mentioning really President Trump at all, but referencing the real leadership he'd found amongst senior diplomats and State Department employees across the world. He also spoke to a kind of America which doesn't immediately recall the reign of Donald Trump.
All of us, we know, want to leave this place as a better place for the next generation. I'll now return to private life as a private citizen, as a proud American, proud of the opportunity I've had to serve my country. God bless all of you. God bless the American people. God bless America.
Rex Tillerson, who'll be replaced by Mike Pompeo at the end of the month, not for the first time. It might be worth buckling ourselves in for what follows.
Kylie Morris in Washington. Well, we're joined now by Julianne Smith, Deputy National Security Advisor to the former Vice President Joe Biden and a former Policy Director at the Pentagon. Julianne Smith, is this a sharp turn right? And given that Mr. Trump's ambition has been to unpick just about everything Obama's ever done, is the Iran deal in crisis?
I do believe that Pompeo will come into this new job with stronger views on the Iran nuclear deal. It was not a secret in this town that Secretary Tillerson was a supporter of the deal. He felt that changes were needed but wanted to maintain the deal. Pompeo feels otherwise. The president has referenced that. Pompeo himself has called the deal disastrous. And so I think we should expect a very sharpened view and very negative view of the future of this deal come May of this spring. Now, Kylie Morris described how little Tillerson did to rebuild the State Department. I mean, he got rid of a lot of people, but he didn't hire anybody, it seems. Is Pompeo good at building up the State Department? So Pompeo came into the CIA with very low morale. You'll remember that during the campaign and during his first few weeks and months in office, Trump was very negative on the intelligence community. Pompeo then had to lead that agency, and he did succeed in lifting morale to a certain extent. His management of the agency, it's a very small agency, very low profile, has been something that folks have complimented him on. But the State Department is an entirely different beast. The degree to which he can bring up morale at the State Department, move forward with constructive reforms, and get people into those empty seats remains to be seen. We're not sure what type of a diplomat Pompeo will actually be in the highest office in our diplomatic corps. He's someone who has a lot of hard edges and doesn't hold back from saying what he actually thinks. Where do we think we are with the Russians on him, particularly given that Mr. Trump was a little slow in any way using the word Russia when it came to the attempted murder of the double spy and his daughter in this country? That's right. The president was slow to respond to the nerve gas attack in the United Kingdom. And I think what we'll see is Pompeo will look to the president for guidance on Russia. He likes to stay closely aligned with Trump on all issues. The one interesting point is that Pompeo has spoken openly about Russian interference in our election. He's not convinced it actually altered the outcome of our election, but the fact that he acknowledges it, unlike the president, is significant. I think we should look at Pompeo's Senate confirmation hearing, which will be coming up in April, for clues as to how he will handle the question of Russia and what his expectations are for U.S. foreign policy going forward in that regard. Now, yesterday, Rex Tillerson was very robust in condemning Russia. Do you think that was the straw that broke a very wounded camel's back? I'm not entirely convinced about that. I think Tillerson has known for quite some time that he had the prospect of leaving. It's been rumored around town for months now. We've been talking about his departure for weeks. And so I think he knew that he differed from the president on a number of things that were important to Trump, the Iran deal and on Russia. I'm sure the statement that Tillerson issued in regard to the nerve agent attack did not help his case, but I also think Trump is looking forward at this potential negotiation with the North Koreans and really wants somebody in the chair that he trusts. And what became clear over recent months is that the president did not trust Rex Tillerson. And blindsided, of course, on North Korea. It seems that neither the State Department nor the Pentagon knew a thing about it. That's absolutely correct. It seems to be a decision that came out of thin air. I'm not sure anyone in Congress knew this was coming. Certainly the president's own team at State and DOD. This is typical for how this administration takes decisions. The president shoots from the hip. He takes last-minute decisions that seem to come to him in the moment. He seizes on opportunities as he sees them, but it leaves the interagency in complete disarray. And it has left this administration administration unprepared to actually execute that decision. They don't have a lot of staff on hand at the highest levels, particularly on the Asia team, that could help prepare for such a negotiation. And so I think it's going to be a difficult couple weeks.
Julianne Smith in Washington, thank you very much indeed.
Move on to some of the day's other news, because in the biggest change yet for the Trump administration, the president has sacked his Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, following a series of public disagreements. Mr. Trump announced his decision on social media and told reporters that he and Mr. Tillerson had had a different mindset on some key issues, including the nuclear deal with Iran. The director of the CIA, Mike Pompeo, has been named as Mr. Tillerson's replacement, as our North America editor John Sopel tells us.
After a long trip to Africa, glad-handing and promoting the US, Rex Tillerson flew back to Washington overnight. But unbeknown to him, the president had signed his death warrant, and it would be death by tweet. Mike Pompeo, director of the CIA, will become our new Secretary of State. He'll do a fantastic job. Thank you to Rex Tillerson for his service. But Tillerson isn't on Twitter, so excruciatingly, it fell to his chief of staff to inform him of his demise. There was no contact from the White House. Only this afterwards from the president.
I think Rex will be much happier now, but I really appreciate his service.
Happier? He didn't seem it. In his farewell statement, he never mentioned Donald Trump by name, didn't thank him or wish him luck. Instead, there were these pointed remarks on Russia.
Much work remains to respond to the troubling behavior and actions on the part of the Russian government. Russia must assess carefully as to how its actions are in the best interest of the Russian people and of the world more broadly. I, Rex Tillerson, solemnly swear.
It was all so different when he was sworn in, then seen as one of the grown-ups of the administration. But his fate was probably sealed last October, when it was reported he called Donald Trump a moron, an accusation he didn't exactly deny.
I'm not going to deal with petty stuff like that. I mean, this is what I don't understand about Washington. Again, I'm not from this place, but the places I come from, we don't deal with that kind of petty nonsense.
And then there was the public undermining of the Secretary of State by the President, sending family to do work that would normally be done by America's chief diplomat, and public shaming on Twitter like this. I told Rex Tillerson, our wonderful Secretary of State, that he's wasting his time trying to negotiate with Little Rocket Man. There's not much love lost between Donald Trump and Rex Tillerson. They disagreed on policy and didn't much like each other personally. Mike Pompeo will be much more to Donald Trump's taste, and it's vital they do get on given the importance of subjects like North Korea. But will he be the man who says to the president, "I think you're wrong," as Rex Tillerson did? Tillerson was isolated, traipsing around the world with little support in Washington. In his previous life, the former CEO of Exxon was a corporate titan, but he's now political roadkill. Surely the place with the lowest life expectancy anywhere in the world being a member of the Trump administration. Another senior figure who didn't smell the coffee. John Sopel, BBC News, Washington.
Well, we referred to it already. Rex Tillerson, US Secretary of State, has finally, after months of chat about it, been sacked by President Trump. Mr. Tillerson was not reportedly actually told, other than finding out with everyone else when the president announced it on Twitter. One satirical website suggested that Tillerson had been surprised to find he was still in the job. He had certainly been semi-detached from the Trump operation for almost his entire period in office.
I, Rex Tillerson, do solemnly swear.
When he was appointed 13 months ago, Rex Tillerson was an outsider. He wasn't a politician, but a former Exxon chief executive, and he'd never met Donald Trump until he was offered the job. At his Senate confirmation, a record number of votes went against him. Democrats suggested he was too pro-Putin. Now, of course, the line is he's been sacked because he's too anti-Russian for President Trump. That's not the president's line.
We got along actually quite well, but we disagreed on things. When you look at the Iran deal, I think it's terrible. I guess he thought it was okay. I wanted to either break it or do something, and he felt a little bit differently.
And President Trump is right. They clearly have been at odds, in tone and substance, again and again. In the summer, Tillerson openly registered his opposition to Trump's plan to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accords.
I was free to express my views. I took a counter view to the decision that was made, but I fully appreciate the elements behind why he took the decision.
And then there was a striking interview that Tillerson gave to Fox News after racist violence in Charlottesville, distancing himself from the president's views.
I don't believe anyone doubts the American people's values or the commitment of the American government or the government's agencies to advancing those values and defending those values.
And the president's values?
The president speaks for himself, Chris.
Tempting as it is to see this in terms of policy differences, perhaps the real story is just the chaos in the White House. John Kerry, Hillary Clinton, Condoleezza Rice, Colin Powell, Madeleine Albright and Warren Christopher, the last 6 secretaries of state, have all served 4 years, not a mere 1. And no one needs reminding that there have been all too many comings and goings in an administration so young.
Well, Mr. Tillerson's replacement is Mike Pompeo, who's been running the CIA. He's a more Trumpian figure. He remarked at one stage that some inmates who had declared a hunger strike at Guantanamo looked like they'd put on weight. He's also a defender of the CIA after a Senate report on torture, after it detailed practices such as waterboarding. He was saying, well, they're heroes, not torturers. So where are things at the State Department and in the White House? I'm joined from Washington by David Frum. He was a speechwriter for George W. Bush, has recently written a book about Donald Trump's White House, and Applebaum is still with me. David Frum, how will history remember Rex Tillerson's period as Secretary of State, do you think?
Very likely as Donald Trump's least bad Secretary of State. I think we are clearly heading toward a period of greater instability and greater unpredictability from the president. I'll direct attention to a story that may not have broken in Britain. It was sort of a local story here, but it's indicative of what's going on. Rex Tillerson was not the only person in the Trump administration to lose his job today. Donald Trump also lost his chief personal aide, the person who would walk around with the president and hold on to things for him. And it turns out he was escorted out of the building to a new job at the Trump campaign because he's under investigation for serious financial crimes, quote unquote. That's the kind of thing that is happening more and more at the Trump White House. People going out for reasons that in other administrations would have prevented them from even serving as visitors, never mind as staff.
And Applebaum, were you a fan of Rex Tillerson?
No, I think Rex Tillerson will be remembered as a really disastrous Secretary of State. He treated the State Department as if it were a kind of non-performing part of Exxon, and he tried to reform it on that basis. He stuck to a very tiny group of advisors. He ignored diplomats and experts. He tried to do large-scale reforms, which nobody really knew the point of. They seemed mostly to do with cutting money, which is not really how you want to push a diplomatic corps. All kinds of people left the State Department under his tenure.
There were huge numbers of exits.
Huge numbers of exits,
yeah.
Far fewer people joining. He made diplomacy seem like an unattractive thing. Having said that, just, these two things are not exclusive. You can say on the one hand, he was a terrible Secretary of State, and you can also say on the other hand, the next one might not be better. So it's not clear that we have reasons to rejoice.
Okay, well, David Frum, do we think Mike Pompeo is going to be less of a restraining influence on the president, and thus the world becomes more subject to the Trumpian mood changes and policy changes?
Well, Mike Pompeo, who was a businessman and then a member of Congress, was, as director of the CIA, a much more sensitive reader of the president's personality than Rex Tillerson. He invested much more effort in keeping on Donald Trump's sunny side. So he will bend more to the presidential will than Rex Tillerson. And he seems more in line with the president's views on Iran. But we are escalating already a crisis in the Korean Peninsula. The idea that we're going to now be escalating a crisis with Iran as well, 2 nuclear crises at one time, that's at least 1 more than we should have, and many people might think it maybe 2 more than we should have.
Yeah, and expand on your idea, David, about more instability to come now. I'm thinking in foreign policy. I mean, you've got all these crises, but just in terms of the sort of the day-to-day stuff outside of the 3 or 4 critical sort of things that are on the top of the Secretary of State's list,
Well, Donald Trump has repeatedly said, both today in person and previously on Twitter, that he has his administration not quite the way he wants it, almost the way he wants it. It's indicating that more changes are probably to come, and he also seems to be more and more impatient of any kind of restraint on him. So that augurs ill for those members of his administration who have tried to restrain him in one way or another. Chief of Staff John Kelly, National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, generally admired people in Washington, people who are good at their jobs, and people who have often told the president, no, you can't do this, or no, you can't do that.
And I mean, it feels like people have been coming and going so frequently. Can we really believe that for another 3 years or for another 7 years under Trump, that sort of pace of chaos can carry on?
It happens in other countries. Italy for years and years had governments that changed constantly. There are Latin American countries where people come and go all the time. We've got used to thinking of the United States as a stately model where more or less things happen slowly and administrations don't change. And as your program showed, secretaries of state stick around for 4 years. But there's really no reason why we should expect that. I mean, this is a president who wants to hear, he wants people to express his will. When they don't express his will,
every president wants them to be aligned with his view, don't they? I mean,
but this is a bit more. This is not just aligned with his view. He doesn't want to hear people contradicting him. It seems that what he didn't like about Tillerson was that Tillerson sometimes said, "Well, no, Mr. President, that's not how the way these things are. I see it differently," and he doesn't want that. Mike Pompeo, what we know about him is that what he has been very good at is briefing the president, is aligning his views with those of the president. He's done a couple of things that I think are quite worrisome. One of them is he actually lied about a CIA report. He said that, it showed that there was no Russian interference of significance in the election, whereas actually the report said the opposite. So we know that he's willing to bend the truth in those ways.
David Frum, I don't want to talk much more about Russia, but how much was Russia the issue in the sacking of Rex Tillerson, do you think?
We don't really know the answer to that question because we don't know exactly when Rex Tillerson was fired. The president was clearly on his way to this decision. He's been on his way to it for a while. The chief of staff, John Kelly, it has been said to reporters that he had indicated to Tillerson on Friday, be braced for bad news. But the actual action of firing him happened today, the day after Rex Tillerson agreed with Britain, gave support to Britain, in a way that is much more full-throated than the president has yet done. The president has not yet agreed that Theresa May was correct in what she said to the House of Commons. And what is so shocking about that is in any normal administration that the United States and Britain would have worked out their statements in advance. There would have been a private agreement before either country made a public statement on a matter so serious. Instead, Donald Trump has undercut Theresa May after she's taken a public position. That's really troubling, and I'm sure it troubled Rex Tillerson.
David Frum and Applebaum, thank you both.
And meanwhile, Boris Johnson lauding the fact that Rex Tillerson, the US Secretary of State, had come out in support of the UK's actions, or whatever we had intended to do last night. He has been sacked unceremoniously by Donald Trump.
Well, there's a really sticky moment this morning. When the news came through, actually, right in the middle of the Chancellor's spring statement, everyone's phones erupted as the Chancellor was speaking. The Prime Minister herself was passed a note by one of her backbenchers to tell her, listen, just so you know, Rex Tillerson, our biggest ally so far in the fight against Putin, he's been sacked, so no ally in America anymore. Luckily, Donald Trump then came out a few hours later. Theresa May finally tracked him down on board Air Force One and got a phone call through to him about 6 o'clock tonight. But the Tillerson sacking is absolutely extraordinary. Trump is going through senior grown-up after senior grown-up and getting rid of them simply because they stand up to him and tell him a few home truths and even a bit of natural reality about world politics. Tillerson clashed with him on a myriad of different things. Iran tearing up the nuclear deal, North Korea, whether it's good to go and meet Kim Jong-un, and eventually Trump said enough is enough, you're out. And of course he learned, how did he learn about the sacking? P45 polite letter on Twitter.
Yeah. But the conspiracy theorist in me says that one of the reasons why kind of Trump is swinging in behind this, I'm going to condemn Russia, is it looks good for Trump. And also it's a good diversion from his own local problems with Russia, because he has this investigation where people think, the Russians and him colluded in his own general election. So in a way, it's not unhelpful for him to be sending out a kind of a global signal saying, oh, yes, I'm going to tick the Russians off. But actually, what can he really do about it? The interesting thing about Rex Tillerson is that, you know, Donald Trump actually fought quite hard for him to get through all the Senate state hearings. And one of the things that really concerned people is that Rex Tillerson had lots of connections with Russia. So there's all these kind of things that lead back to Russia, which is fascinating. But I think Donald Trump is going to be left where he's going to have a support staff of himself, the TweetDeck and Ivanka Trump.
And I think probably the truth is
Kellyanne Conway, yeah.
Rex Tillerson, from the moment he called Donald Trump a moron, really the writing was on the wall from you don't really call your boss a moron no matter who you are, especially if your office Donald Trump, and expect to keep your job.
Although he did speak for a nation. Yeah. And a world.
Yeah, the prototypes of the Mexican Wall looked interesting tonight as well, didn't they?
I've been getting away with it all